Changemakers, Jay here. Before we dive in to the episode, I just wanted to really say a couple quick things. One is just a note of gratitude for each of you that is watching this or that's tuning in to the audio version, to the podcast of this. Every single week, we try to come with you with the most interesting content that we can create all around helping you create and choose legacy over currency in your own life. And this week is no different. This week, we have an amazing guest on. You'll hear me do an introduction for him in literally just a few seconds. But all you need to know about him is that he is a mental game coach and mental warfare, if we had to dive into it. And he specifically works with poker players. He has worked with day traders, people in the financial industry, and now he's transitioning into working with successful entrepreneurs. And we dived into a lot in this episode, and really, what is the mental game needed to be successful in life? At one point of the interview, he completely disagrees with me on something that I've talked about multiple times on this podcast, and I think it's a bit of agree to disagree in terms of reframes and using that as a solution. But if you want to be successful, if you want to have a strong inner mental game, then I know you're gonna love this interview, and I won't hold you back any further because you'll hear me introduce him in literally just a few seconds. But last thing is, if you are loving this content, if you're watching this on YouTube, please hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone that may need to see this. If you're listening to this on the podcast version, I would love it if you gave us a quick rating and review. That's the way that we kind of ensure to make sure that we get the best guests on, from millionaires and billionaires to some of the New York bestsellers that are your favorites. So without any further delay, here is the interview with Jared Tendler. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another interview at the Inner Changemaker. So excited to be bringing you this episode because you know how much we love to talk about high performance on this show. Well, my guest is a leading expert in the mental game. In fact, he is one of the mental game coaches of some of the closest entrepreneurs in my own life, and he's worked with athletes, and he's famously worked with a lot of poker players, and now expanding into financial trades as well as high performers from all different areas. He's the author of 2 books, The Mental Game of Poker 1 and 2, has an amazing podcast called The Mental Game, and here to talk to us a little bit about what gives us that mental edge in high performance. Mr. Jared Tendler, welcome to the show, brother.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, hey, so excited that we got a chance to finally do this and get a chance to hang out, because I know you have some really high profile clients that you work with, and when it comes to mental game and mental edge, I think sometimes it sounds really interesting to people, but on the other hand, they go, well, it seems like a mindset thing. I want to get to the actionable stuff. I want to get to the tactics, right? So for you, how do you define mental game? Like, how do you position it for yourself and when you kind of introduce that topic to people?
Yeah, I think the term like mental game like really encapsulates kind of like what's it about. Like when you call it a game, inherently there's a strategy to it. And so in order to have a good strategy, you need to kind of know the rules of the game. And so when I look at the mental game and where I position it, it's like, how well do you understand how the mind works, how the brain operates, how emotions influence thinking, some of the kind of the basic rules of this game. A lot of people don't know those basic rules. And if you don't know them, then your strategies to try to control your emotions, actually resolve your emotions, to think better, to be more positive, those types of topics get really compromised if you don't know the rules. And frankly, there are even people kind of in my space that don't know the rules. And I say people in my space, I mean, I came from the therapy world. Like I'm a licensed therapist. I never intended on practicing, but I wanted to understand like why my golf game was failing when I was trying to become a professional golfer, and realized that sports psychology, golf psychology was a bit too behavioral, a little bit too simplistic in its solving of deeper problems. And so I got a degree in counseling psychology, got licensed, 3,200 hours, supervised practice, etc., all to kind of understand how to like weave those two things together.
Yeah.
And I was at a conference 10 years ago, And this concept was being presented, and it was like earth-shattering news to a variety of the therapists that were there. And it was very simple. The emotional system has the power to shut down higher brain function.
Mm.
That principle, if you don't understand, your strategy for solving emotional issues becomes severely compromised. So it was just mind-boggling to me that, like cognitive behavioral strategies, using mantras, trying to control emotion in the heat of battle, those things are severely compromised because you need strength in your thoughts, strength in your mind to be able to fight back against the emotions. But if your emotions rise too high, you don't actually have any strength mentally to be able to fight back. So that's just like one example of one of these rules that is sort of inherent to the mental game, and a lot of the things that I work on with my clients. So it's a lot of sort of systemic, conceptual-based strategies that becomes a thing that can be learned. And I like that it's called a game because the strategy is ongoing. I don't believe that we're ever going to sort of solve life, that we're going to solve
Right.
There's always going to be something, even if it's the most like kind of basic or like nuanced way of kind of extracting edge using high level visualization or next level kind of breathing techniques, things like that.
Yeah. And did you find, I mean, this is already like, I'm fascinated already, and I'm like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted to, almost selfishly dive into. But it's obviously awesome to have you on and share with our community and our audience. For you, I'm just curious because how did you kind of find that motivation, to study, behavioral science and get into this whole mental game? Did you find like growing up that you had a strong, I guess, impulse to have greater control on your emotions, or was there any scenarios or stories that you kind of lost your emotions and let your emotions get the better end of the situation?
Yeah, I would say not at all until it became a necessity. 18 years old, the freshman, the summer after my freshman year of college, I tried qualifying for the U.S. Open. And for those that don't know, the U.S. Open is actually one of the major events in golf that is actually like literally open, right?
Right.
There's only about 50 players out of 156 that are automatically qualified into the event. Everybody else, including a majority of PGA Tour players, have to go through one of two stages of qualifying. Now, the majority of PGA Tour players get exempt into the sectionals, the second stage of qualifying. But I, as an amateur golfer, collegiate golfer, as long as I had a low enough handicap, pay my $150, and I had a chance. So that year, I tried qualifying, played literally some of the best golf of my life, tee to green, and I basically choked on the greens. I missed qualifying by a shot, and had 4 or 5 putts that I missed that were putts that I would normally have made, but the pressure got to me, and my putting was the weaker part of my game, and so I was at that point just like selfishly motivated to understand like what the heck happened. I'm sure that there was emotional instability before that, but before then I was just completely oblivious to it. I had no clue, really. I had no sort of inner life. I had no sort of introspective ability to kind of understand myself at that point. But that kind of began the road. And so I started looking into golf psychology books, read kind of the godfather at the time, Bob Rotella, and started basically researching and trying to apply those concepts to myself. And what I found was that a majority of the concepts like helped, but they did not help under extreme pressure. So my golf game continued to get better over the next couple years. I was a 3-time All-American, Division III college golf, but still high level. Won 9 events. But every time I would go and try to compete nationally at these individual massive events, my game would continue to kind of crumble. So it was at that point that I realized, like, okay, there's something that's not like happening here. There has to be some deeper flaw or some deeper reason why I'm not able to have these this progress like transfer over under this extreme pressure. And if you look at what most of golf psychology, most of what traditional sports psychology is designed to do, it's designed to teach you how to have a right mindset. And
Yeah.
like what that means is something that's very, very static. It's think this way, feel this way, focus on this, don't focus on that, yada, and we're trying to kind of create this ideal. And I think that is incredibly arrogant. And I mean that in the sense that like somehow we've found this permanent ideal and it's never going to evolve. And that just didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me as I started to think more deeply about it. And so what I started to look at was, okay, well, what might be the underlying reasons for why this might occur? And I had a very sort of poignant moment because it was I guess it was my junior year of college.
Yeah.
Realizing that like I hadn't solved these mental game issues. I like wanted to play professional golf. Like that was my goal. I always wanted to. I went to a good school so that I had something to fall back on if professional golf didn't work out. But I always sort of saw myself in the golf industry in some way. But it was at that point I was realizing like maybe I don't really have what it takes, and I'm not one to just try something just for the sake of trying it.
Sure.
I really had to believe that I had a chance of doing it. So I was having like more of these kind of like big, kind of heady, like esoteric questions, like what am I going to do with my life? And I was literally in the middle of a golf tournament, had a 5-foot putt on like the 13th hole, and I'm standing there, a couple other guys in the group, and they're putting up and going through their routines, and I'm just standing there like looking at my putt going, if I make this, what does it mean? Like, does it change who I am? And it was like, I didn't realize it at the time, but afterwards I realized that golf became like a perfect reflection in that moment of like this, my emotional state, my mental state, like what was going on for me in my life at that point. And I started to think, okay, well maybe, people have always talked about golf being like a metaphor for life. So if that's true, then maybe we can use that metaphor. And so my idea was to do golf therapy. And golf therapy was literally going to take out people, didn't have to be golfers, out to the golf course and use the environment and the playing of the game as a chance to better understand ourselves and try to work through some of these deeper problems. Yeah. And it wasn't really until I kind of got into that process that I started to blend the sports psychology and this therapy kind of interest. That's what kicked it off, was very kind of big questions. I started diving deeper into psychology. My first psychology class, I got a C. My second psychology class, it was like experimental psych. I got literally an F on my first test. It was like the first time I'd ever done that badly. But basically what it did for me was realize that I just couldn't half-ass this. Business always came easy to me. Golf, I worked my butt off, but in academics, I'd never really tried that hard. Yeah. And so it was at that point where I started kicking that into gear and really just kind of dove into it. And like I said, the rest is kind of history at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, it's awesome to kind of hear you talk about those things because, I think in life and personal development, high performance, there's a lot of things we could draw, analogies from, right? One that comes to mind when you were talking about golf, right? The kind of an infamous one, I guess, from Tony Robbins, when he talks about, when you hit the ball, you're only like almost a few angles off. And it's because you hit it in a certain way, but you end up in either one side of the field or you end up on the green, and you can end up in different areas, compounded over time. Mm-hmm. And I know you came so highly recommended to not just be on the show, but just for me to just get to know and see some of the work that you do. And when I was diving in, I looked at some of the people, not only that you've had on your podcast, but some of the really big names in poker. Right. And I'm sure in some of your own clients from EA Sports to some of the entrepreneurs you've worked with, what have you found now to be maybe the biggest difference in your life now that you kind of have a deeper understanding of this? As you said, it's kind of a game that you keep evolving at. What's been like the biggest benefit of having a better, deeper understanding of one's mental game, and maybe you could use some examples of certain people you've worked with, because I know even in looking at some of the previous interviews, I know for people that were at the poker table, they were saying anybody that got a chance to work with you, they were more focused, more relaxed, and that's kind of the state that they were in, even though the stakes were so high, right? So is that kind of like the biggest benefit? Just trying to give us an idea here.
Yeah, the biggest benefit is that both for me personally and with my clients, that the results that we're after come automatically. And that's important because there's only so much space that you have like within your mind, right? There's a limit, right? So this is another one of these rules, right? Working memory has between 5 and 9 pieces of information that you can weigh at one time, and that's under ideal circumstances. But when emotions rise, that space can shrink if you are not able to manage that stress and pressure. So there's a finite room for you to think about. And we want you to fill that space entirely with things related to the thing that you're doing. If you're at the poker table, you only want to focus on what your opponents are doing, how you're thinking about your hand, how you're thinking about the next hand, what your strategy is, all the technical stuff. For me in golf, you don't want to have to be fighting against these internal urges to get pissed off, to crumble under the pressure, to lose confidence, or to get bored or get distracted. If you have to fight against that, if you have to use mental space to fight, then all of a sudden you're kind of chopping out space within that needs to be focused on those tactically relevant things. So the biggest benefit is automatic control, which in my world I call resolution. Right? To actually resolve an emotional problem is transformational. It's not incremental in terms of progress. Like the clients that I've worked with, and certainly the work that I've done for myself, it is hard to fully kind of explain to people like what it is like to be on the other side of some of these deeper emotional issues, or even just emotional issues that happen just within the space of their competition. Now, for me personally, my personal issues got played out through playing golf, and I needed to work both from a like technical perspective within the game, like how I actually thought around the golf course, how I prepared myself for each shot, the process that I went through for that, how I reacted to mistakes. There were a lot of like relevant dynamics and issues that popped up within the game, but some of them were actually fed through personal issues that I had. Right. High expectations of myself, a tendency to kind of like wing it and kind of rely on like momentum and like this overconfident sort of style. And so that, of course, bled into all of the decisions that I made. But that's not true for everybody that I work with. Sometimes they are just these tactically based problems. But either, regardless, like whether or not it's just kind of in the game or it's also personal, when you resolve those issues, you have a sense of freedom. And a freedom from those things. Like you don't have to now worry about, like, I mean, there's a word that people use a lot, which I don't subscribe to, called self-sabotage. Where you are basically the reason why you suck, right? And people think that it's like I sabotage myself. It's kind of a bullshit word, because in large measure, you're not good enough to actually sabotage yourself. The reason why you're failing in that moment is because you don't understand what's tripping you up. You don't understand the dynamics of how your emotional system or how your mind is compromising your ability to perform in that time. So thinking that you're self-sabotaging is actually overconfident. So point is that when you resolve those issues at a deeper level, you automatically have the control that you need in the moment. So one of the biggest moments of realization for me about the work that I had done was, in 2000 I graduated, 2001 I graduated college, 2003 I got my master's degree, by 2005 I got my license, and by 2006 I was working in Arizona at a golf course, partnered with a golf instructor, doing work with amateur golfers, professionals, everyday amateurs, and also working a lot on my game. Sure. And over one weekend, I shot 63, 65, 69, playing in some big kind of cash game events or groups at this course. And this golf course was a legit place. They had held LPGA Tour events there. There was a lot of good tour players that kind of came through there. My point is that at that point I realized I had solved all of the issues that I had previously struggled with in college. And I had not played a whole lot of golf, from 2001 to 2005. but the personal work that I had done had sunk in. And I was able to get into a zone, not just the zone, but a zone that I had never achieved before, and able to kind of go deep and allow my game to just run.
Yeah.
And it was not like the first time that I really sort of saw in golf, like the power of resolution, the power of what it means to not have to fight against yourself, to have that kind of control. So that to me is the biggest value.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people resonate with that, right? I think of the book Steve Pressfield, War of Art. He talks about the resistance, and how amateurs pretty much find any excuse to not do the work and complain and be a victim, whereas the pros, right, of anything, they feel the same resistance, they feel the same fears, and yet they still do the work, they still do the things.
So I actually disagree with you. So
okay.
The pros are going. Yeah, the pros in my mind that I work with. Okay. They don't feel those fears.
Interesting.
We've solved them. I mean, I think in large measure the concept of resolution has not really taken hold yet. I mean, honestly, if there is one thing that I achieve in this lifetime, it's making resolution mainstream and so obvious and normal to people that we never would think another way. Right. Cognitive behavioral therapy is, in some spaces of the psychology world, like the gold standard because of what kinds of results it can produce in the short term.
Yeah.
But it does not always guarantee those results hold up under the long term because it doesn't change fundamentally a person's sort of wiring at a deep level. They're not able to heal the old emotion that is producing faulty logic, that is producing these fears. So you can think about, like, let's say, and actually an analogy that I use with people is like, imagine if you on your computer right now had Windows 95 installed, and you laid on top of it, Windows 10. Yeah. Like, occasionally you're going to get these error codes that are going to pop up. Now, what CBT does, and what a lot of sports psychology does, people who use meditation, who use exercise, who use nutrition, who use diets, even like within their sport, they use these things at a level that I think is ineffective for what they're really after. These are all healthy things, and I'm not saying don't do them. Sure. But if you're doing them to hide and protect these like error codes, then you're never really going to actually achieve a sense of freedom and ability to not have to be fighting against that. Yes, there will always be resistance because we will never solve this game. And the resistance is always going to come from what is our kind of back edge, right? But if we can upgrade to Windows 8 and only have a small space between what is our back end and what is our current best, then the resistance becomes easy. Very often, like if you take a player who, and anybody listening to this right now can just do a gut check of this. If you can think about yourself at your absolute worst and like really be just brutally honest about what that's like, because a lot of people will say certain things happen and they'll rationalize it by saying, oh, that's so unlike me, that'll never happen again, I should have never done this. Sure. Bullshit. It happened. It's part of you. If it will continue to happen unless you solve the roots of why. Take that back edge, take the reality of where you are at your worst and compare it to where you are at your best. If that gap is too wide, performance will be inconsistent. There will be a lot of resistance because basically the only thing that is guaranteed to show up every single day is your worst. You have to prepare yourself. You have to sleep. You have to eat properly. You have to do all of this stuff to have the right amount of energy, to have the right perspective. And that kind of earns you more of, more space up to your best.
Right. So it's your responsibility.
It's your responsibility. Exactly.
I love that you say that the worst will show up. Guaranteed. Yeah,
guaranteed. Right? Because there's no friction there. There is zero resistance to your worst. The resistance comes to create your best. So how much you're going to have to fight for your best depends on the gap, the space, the literal distance between your best and worst. The bigger that gap, the more resistance, the more fight that is necessary, which means you're going to be more inconsistent. Why? Because it takes a shit ton of energy. Yeah. If there's this narrow gap between your best and your worst, it is so easy for you to perform well. It doesn't mean you're always going to perform well, but it means your ability to adapt and respond and and make more kind of in-game tactical adjustments or decisions is so much easier. So that like not fighting yourself is transformational. But this all started because you were talking about, the resistance, those fears. One of my first poker playing clients did a brain scan, and this was a really cool opportunity because he was one of the best online poker players from like 2007, 2008 until about 2011 when the government shut down online poker in the U.S. At least made it illegal for the operators to be working. Okay. And he was able to play between 10 and 15, 16 tables at one time. So he may not have been necessarily the best poker player like technically, but his ability to play incredibly high level poker over that kind of sample was enormous. And a lot of the big things that we did in our work was to remove anger for him because imagine, poker is sometimes hard for people to really understand. There is so much luck in the short term that it can drive people insane. Best example I can give, just while we're on the subject of golf, is imagine just hitting perfect drives down the middle of the fairway, and every time it hits a sprinkler head and goes out of bounds, and you lose the ball. Yeah. Over time, like it can drive you mad, but that's what happens in poker. The better players are going to lose against worse players so bad. It's like a PGA Tour player playing up against a high school golfer. The gap is so large that they will never lose. But in poker, they're going to lose a lot. So he had a lot of trouble managing that, and that was a big part of what we did. But eventually we got to the point where I was able to help him train to be in the zone. And for 8 hours a time, playing 1,000 hands an hour, he was able to play in the zone. He did this brain scan. One of the things that the researcher found was for him, his ability to get in the zone was not stimulated by internal chaos, which is different, right? A lot of people tend to be stimulated by fear, by frustration, right? Michael is a prime example of somebody who needed anger to fuel him to be in the zone. Right.
To go out and win and go out and do the things that he was doing.
Exactly. So this client was able to perform at an incredibly high level because he wanted to, because there was more purity and motivation and desire and passion and love for what he did and to be the best that he could possibly be. Yeah. And that's what produced the zone, not this internal fear of failing, fear of making mistakes, fear of being stupid, being pissed off that you didn't get the promotion or pissed off that, your customers didn't respond to what you thought was right or this insecurity. There was purity to it, and that's what resolution can provide.
So this is really interesting because I loved all actually I love that story because I wanted to ask you, I think for, let's say public speaking for an example, right? A lot of people, they say it's number one fear of the entire world. And, I think people resonate with that on a certain degree when they do their first few ones and, they see a few hundred people out there and it could be nerve-wracking, right? For a whole, different, all these different reasons, from historically speaking to maybe they're just nervous to have the mic and project their voice out into the audience. But I was going to ask, like, what about all the people that, for me, I've come to realize that, and this could be a total blind spot based off of your example, which is, instead of, I essentially reframe the fear, right? I essentially it's not like I don't feel it, I do feel it, but however, I choose to do something different with it in those moments, right? And to me, I don't necessarily know if I call that necessarily high performance. I just call that like a reframe for myself.
Yeah.
And so
it helps you perform.
Right. But I also think it also humanizes, like when I share about my own experience and I share that with others, if like in the scenario of I'm trying to help people, let's say better, be a better public speaker, for example. So, but I love in your example, I guess what I want to say is, you're saying with resolution, meaning they don't have that fear anymore, right? So you do not need to reframe that, and you're choosing to perform at a higher level because you can.
Yeah, at that point, it's no longer a choice.
Because it's the only option.
The only option, right? Now, you're not like it doesn't that doesn't guarantee high performance because you need to prepare what you're going to say. And like your definition of performance at that point is probably going to change. It might mean that you can say in 5 minutes what used to take 15. It used to mean maybe that you can engage the audience in a more humanistic way, a deeper way, a more entertaining way. So, you know, what performance means to you today is absolutely compromised by you having to manage this reframing. Because even if you're not like actively thinking about it in the middle of your presentation, because you're at that point engaged in what you're saying, internally there is a fight. So going back to the computer analogy, it's like there are programs running around right? They're running, they're sucking up hard drive or memory space. But they're not actually kind of active. They're not obvious, but they are there sucking up resources. When those things are deactivated or turned off or resolved, again, there's a freedom to sort of move on to the next level because now you're not really fighting yourself. So, you know, for you or for anybody else that might have, you know, difficulties with public speaking, you want to just start asking yourself some like very real why questions. Like, okay, if I strip away all of the logic that I have that protects me from performing, you know, worse than normal, which again is, I'm not saying that's a bad strategy. I'm just saying that has to be matched with a goal towards no longer having to use that, to graduate from it. So you ask some why questions and say, okay, what is it that I'm really afraid of? Am I afraid of looking stupid? Am I afraid of looking like an idiot? Am I afraid of making a mistake? Am I afraid of just freezing and not knowing what to say? Embarrassing myself? Like, what really is the heart of the fear? And sometimes there are confidence issues there. Sometimes it's purely about you know, the audience and wanting to make a good impression. It's again more of the sort of performance tactically based thing in that moment. Sometimes it goes into the roots of your personal history. So I mean, like a sad but true example for myself in terms of like why was I buckling under the pressure? Well, my parents had a very deep belief in me, especially within golf. I think sometimes almost a little too much belief, but it was not a bad thing. But within that space of support, I created a lot of high expectations for myself. Like I felt like, and I also saw my father was a successful business person, as was my grandfather. So like being young and kind of seeing a lot of success and not really fully understanding like how to get it. You know, I saw like, okay, yeah, they worked hard, but I didn't see like really the ups and downs. So I had high expectations for myself. And those expectations really damaged my confidence because when I performed below my expectations, I was self-critical and very hard on myself in ways that were sort of unfair relative to like where I was in the process. Because I was actually making improvements, but I wasn't making them as fast as I thought I could. So resolving that personal issue started to actually show up on the golf course because now I wasn't afraid of making mistakes. Like now I could actually embrace mistakes. I mean, there's so much logic and ways of reframing in the world. But that collective knowledge, when we get down to the core of it, is not necessary unless it is fundamentally upgrading our perspective on the situation. So some of your reframing might actually be really good and really healthy to correct the fears at a deep level. But if you're only thinking about that in the 5 or 10 minutes before you go on stage or like the night before, imagine a PGA Tour player only practicing the day before they start their tournament. It doesn't make any sense, right? So you know, so sometimes resolution happens when you just train that perspective to the level of unconscious confidence where it's automatic. And doing that means that no longer are you going to have to fight to maintain that perspective. You have it automatically.
So you're essentially practicing your version of perfection and hoping that one of the versions of perfections comes out in performance because you can't guarantee.
No, you can't practice. I mean, you can't practice perfection. I mean,
but you practice like your best.
You practice and train the perspective that leads to it. Think of it more like you can't like. Think of it more like you're like making a bowl, making a soup or putting together a recipe, right? There's these ingredients that need to be present in order to actually make it a soup, make it you know a great casserole or you know lasagna, whatever the hell you make it.
Right.
And if you miss ingredients, then it's going to taste different. So the more that you can train to always have those ingredients present, means that the likelihood is that the soup is going to consistently taste great. But, the variability that exists within there, still means that it's going to be inconsistent. So you're not necessarily training the soup, because that doesn't make sense.
Right.
You're training your ability to make the soup. That is what you're focused on. So these elements of perspective or ways of seeing the situation, certainly you could get more comfortable with the environment. You could do some visualization. You could go there on stage, rehearsing your speech over and over again to the point where it just becomes automatic.
Right.
There's lots of kind of technical parts to it, but in terms of the perspective, it's training that perspective. That's what you're trying to do. Sometimes that perspective cannot reach that level of automaticness or unconscious competence because it's being blocked by deeper emotional issues. It's kind of like two magnets of like attraction. They like repel each other. And so if that training doesn't work and there's something blocking it, that's a lot of times where I step in with my clients. Like they know that they can perform better, but they just keep getting sort of tripped up and undercut. And it's usually because there's something deeper that's not being evaluated and corrected, allowing that knowledge to kind of click in, allowing that perspective to click in and be there automatically.
So I had a question about this when you said this earlier, that you use your own personal example that you had to kind of go back, to the roots of, maybe some of these problems of some certain things that kind of triggered you in one way in another, and it wasn't connecting for you. Is that something you found consistent with every, or a lot of the clients that you worked with? And for people that are listening to the show, you mentioned some of the why questions, right? Is that maybe a place for them to start of seeing what is actually happening? Why am I getting, fearful of the situation, or why am I so angry in the situation? Where is that anger kind of traced back to? Is that kind of some of the thinking there?
It can be. Again, I think there are two categories of what I would call like performance issues. So like high expectations, just showing up in this space as a business person, as a poker player, as a golfer. They don't show up elsewhere in life. And that can happen because oftentimes the thing that we care about the most can draw out these issues. And again, high expectations for years has not been a problem.
Okay. Yep.
Like they're a very common characteristic of very, very high performers.
Yes.
But they have a double-edged sword to them if they erode confidence, and that creates the instability that we're talking about. So again, it's not like these are a bad thing, but for some people, they can become that sort of self-inflicted wound. So it doesn't always mean that there are personal issues to work through. And I've worked with clients that are like that. But there are many people for whom that is the case. So if you're new to this space and trying to analyze yourself, my suggestion would be start with the situation that you're in. If you're in business, if you're in a sport or a form of competition, start with that and begin analyzing your biggest mistakes. And then begin asking yourself why questions from that point. Why is this happening? What are the emotions that are present? What are the thoughts that are kind of running through my head? What are the physical changes? What are the actions, behaviors? Basically do like as clean of an analysis and a description and kind of a mapping of the problem as you can. Then you can start asking yourself the why questions from there. Okay. So do the analysis to get the map, now, for some people, it becomes ridiculously clear, right? You map the problem and you're like, okay, why do I think this is occurring? Well, this is exactly how I responded to failing on a test when I was 17 years old. Now I'm 40 and I'm like literally reacting the exact same way when I get bad feedback from, a presentation. Then clearly you know that there's something much deeper and you have been repeating the same pattern for, a couple decades. Yeah. So no, you can't just simply resolve the issue in present day. You have to actually go back into your personal history and understand how that problem evolved. And from that point, you can really start to heal it at a deeper level, in my opinion. Yeah. Now, sometimes that process can happen very, very quickly, right? You've learned a lot in your 20 years that, at 18 years old, let's say a year after having gotten that failure, like, you didn't really know all of the reasons why you were incredibly successful, why you were, going to go on to great things. Like, you didn't know all that then. And so having had a lot of track record, sometimes it's just about kind of digging into these personal traumas, these personal memories, these personal hang-ups, and like releasing and healing some of the old emotion, old patterning, and from that point, it just kind of just clicks in place.
So making peace with that, right? Making peace with those traumas and those moments.
I'll give you one more perfect, like clean example. Sorry to keep cutting you off.
Sure. No.
The best way that I found to describe this is, imagine having an argument with a friend or a significant other.
Yeah.
And like when you have that tension between you, right? You can feel it, right? Yeah. It's palatable. So that kind of tension and resistance exists for ourselves, right? The 17-year-old with that problem is creating tension with the 40-year-old who is fighting to have the same thing, right? There's tension between those two places. When you resolve it, right? Now you resolve the issue between you and your significant other, right? Automatically you're stronger for it, right? So coming to peace with it is like close, but you can't come to peace with these differences, right? Unless you're just going to accept them and embrace them. Right. Oftentimes you got to work through it and come to an understanding, see the other side, apologize. Like there's some shit to work through sometimes. It's not always. And so you can look at the tension that exists between people as being kind of a model for sometimes what it's like to deal with these, kind of internal problems. Sometimes they're super simple. It was just a misunderstanding. Sometimes they're really complex and they're really deep and they can take weeks to resolve.
Yeah. Well, from a personal note, I'm like, well, it's good that I know how to make peace with things and reframe things, but clearly there's, in the game of high performance and having that mental game, what you talk about, there's still some work, from a personal level for me, which is really interesting. This is, I want to ask you this next question, because I feel like a lot of people, when they're going through life, whether they're a business owner, athlete, or what have you, but they find themselves on a losing streak, and they find themselves, and I know everyone kind of on some level can relate with this, when they feel like they're spiraling out of control and they don't know, they have almost that, maybe they're not quite at the fight or flight mode, but like it feels that way, right? Especially when you're going through it.
Almost panic.
Almost panic. So how does a high performer, or especially someone like yourself, how do you work through that? Or what are the things that maybe you kind of remind yourself, or at least encourage your clients to kind of remind themselves of in those moments? And obviously this comes back to, did you practice, for having the right things there, so that you're not in such a panic that, that you're not really making the right decisions?
Yeah. And the ability to be able to like know the right things to say is a function of how clearly you can understand why each sort of step in that downward spiral is occurring. Yeah. And that's something that I work very closely with my clients. So like we map, like, what does it look like from your very worst to your very best? And we have corrections at every level that we can define along the way so that they're prepared.
Yeah.
But we're always working from the back end up. Now, just like as a construct, as a technique, the simple answer is just take a couple deep breaths, right? Once you recognize the downward spiral is happening, take a couple of deep breaths, not in a kumbaya, like relaxation kind of way. It's to try to create a little bit of separation between the reaction and what you're about to do. Okay, and that separation is just a chance to give you a chance to stabilize yourself. And the next step is injecting logic. Now, injecting logic is like a fancy word for saying thinking, which is no different than cognitive behavioral therapy or any other mantra, or as you called it, the reframing. They're all the same thing. I really am not a stickler for language. I'm a stickler for function. Okay, but when you are spiraling, you need to use thinking as a way of correcting that emotional system, right? So we do a brain scan and we look at what that looks like. In the frontal part of your brain is the prefrontal cortex. That is the section of the brain that is responsible for like kind of squelching and controlling that overactive emotional system. Okay, so in the short term, while you are spiraling, that is your only way of gaining control, unless something random happens where you get lucky and all of a sudden things start going your way, or you get so bad, or it gets so bad, and you're like, all right, I give up. Expectations gone, and now the pressure's gone, and so But if you're still kind of in the chaos,
Mm.
you got to use your mind to fight against. And all of my clients understand very, very clearly that their best chance of controlling their emotional system is catching the downward spiral early, right?
Mm.
Deeper you go, the closer you get to pure panic, right? The emotional system shutting down higher brain function. So the farther you fall, the less power that part of that prefrontal cortex has. The emotional system's too big. It's like how powerful you are. How powerful are you at being able to hold up the wall of a dam?
Yeah, not that powerful. Yeah. Yeah.
But how powerful are you at being able to hold up the wall of a kiddie pool that's about to overflow?
Yeah.
I mean, it's night and day. So when the emotional system is that massive and overactive, I mean, dude, it just, you are not strong enough to hold that back with your thoughts. The thoughts are not that powerful. So you have to catch it early, when you can actually make this a fair fight, and you got to repeat it often. So let's say downward spiral is beginning.
Yeah.
Deep breath, inject logic, and then you feel yourself kind of build back up again. Keep doing it even if the problem isn't happening. You just keep kind of fighting for those inches to maintain yourself and kind of holding yourself in that higher level performance state. Now, what do you say to yourself? That is the big riddle here, right? Anybody that's listening to this, you can take any phrase that you've been using for yourself already. Take what you say to yourself automatically in those moments, right? And try to come up with something that is productive. It was better than nothing, okay? But you got to write it down. You got to study it. You got to learn it. You got to be ready, because when that moment comes, you have to be able to know it in your mind, and be able to have some power to it, have some potency to it. Now, in the long term, the odds are that whatever you come up with right now is going to be inadequate, because it's not actually attacking the root cause of why you're actually going in that downward spiral. Until you get to that point, the degree of impact that you're going to have for that long-term resolution is going to be minimal, right? It's going to kind of keep you in this like holding pattern of control, but not resolution, right? Control is like the stage that comes after awareness. Okay, so I've mapped this, right? There are only 3 steps to making progress here. Number 1 is awareness. Number 2 is control. Number 3 is resolution. Okay, so you can't stop a problem you can't see. At 17 years old, when I was blind to all of my emotional instability, I couldn't stop any of it because I couldn't see it. Okay, so G.I. Joe is right. Knowing is half the battle. Okay. Knowing what your problems are, just being able to see it, is half the battle, man. It's a huge accomplishment. Okay? Now, being able to see it does not automatically mean you can control it, and that is a huge, huge concept for a lot of people to understand. Because in these early stages, it is so hard to be able to have control at all times. Emotion is small, situation's not that high pressure, you inject logic. Yeah, it's not perfect, but you can keep yourself, you can keep your shit together. Yeah. Stakes get bigger, problem gets bigger, bam. You know exactly how you should be thinking in that moment, but you can't do it. It feels like a bigger failure. But what that has just called out is, yep, you're firmly in stage 1, but you haven't really mastered stage 2 yet. You haven't mastered that control. Control means control at all times. Okay? So, and then eventually when we want to get to resolution, so the control goes away and you don't have to worry about that anymore. Right.
So this is so interesting. I mean, I love that you point this out: awareness, control, resolution. Almost selfishly, I have to ask. I mean, from control to resolution, right? You're saying that it doesn't become this thing that you reframe or there's a tactic for you to do. It just becomes the only thing that you do. For that resolution step, I mean, do you find a lot of your clients are necessarily there? And like, how does one go from control to resolution? I'm sure we've highlighted and touched on it in many points of the interview.
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is you either... Okay, so the simple answer is if you know exactly what the flaw is, and you have the correction, then you just have to keep training it and really being prepared every time. So if you're out there, and you have the opportunity, so it's a public, doing some public speaking, or you're doing a pitch to get some investors. If you have this, the logic well known to you, you have to be ready in the moments where the emotions or the pattern starts to pop up again. You're like, oh, yep, I know what this is. Bam, hit it. You have to be ready, because if you don't and you miss that opportunity, well, guess what? You've just gotten better at the problem. I'm sure you've talked about this in other discussions. Yeah. Learning is never neutral. You're either making progress or you're getting better at the problem. So you have to be ready in these moments to be able to inject that logic and inject the correction, basically. And like, if you're unable to, it just means you weren't ready, right? And again, this is all presuming that we know exactly what the flaw is. Okay. Now, where it gets complex is knowing what the problem is really, really hard sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, that's like the
I can imagine
expertise. Like that's like, so if I look at, okay, you know, I started practicing in 2005. You know, now we're 13 years later. Like, if I can say like one thing that I have gotten better at over the years, and there's not one thing, but for me, it's the easiest to track.
Sure.
Like, the speed with which I can get at the heart of an issue has increased, you know, I don't even know how many times. But like, where it used to maybe take like 4 to 6 sessions to kind of get a full picture.
Right.
Sometimes it happens within 5 or 10 minutes. Sometimes it happens when clients send me their questionnaire and I'm reading through.
And you just, right, you could see it through the way that they're articulating themselves or writing out their problems.
At that point, the game is over for me. The game becomes, how am I going to get them to see it without me just telling them? Because very often I tell them, it doesn't land. I got to kind of move them in the direction. That becomes part of the game too. And I'm probably giving secrets away. But the point is, like, my ability to kind of surgically get at that flaw has increased, you know, exponentially. So it's not fair for anybody listening to feel like they're going to be an expert at this. It's going to take time. And frankly, not only have I done a lot of this work professionally for 13 years, I have kept a journal since I had that, like, you know, realization after that golf tournament for now 20 years.
Wow. So
my own ability to recognize my own patterning is exponentially greater. My understanding of my personal history is exponentially greater, but it's still improving. I mean, I did another round of therapy where, you know, I went to my own therapist. It's the 4th time I've done this in the last 20 years. Okay. You know, I did it for about a year, and like, you know, we got deeper. I mean, that's why I say it's a game. Like, there's an ever evolving nature of this. So so being able to figure out, like, what is at the heart, what is at the root cause of why this problem exists, is how you go from control to resolution. You just can't get there otherwise, unless it just happens randomly and you get lucky.
Right. Well, and I know for tons of people that are listening and watching this, I mean that was a lot, right? Like, we just went through that was a lot, and I took notes, and there were so many great points. Jared, before I ask you the last question, for people that want to dive deeper with you, because obviously I think, you know, everyone wants to do a bit of that breathing right now, and everyone wants to process a little bit to kind of gut check where they're at, right? Yep. With their own performance and their own, you know, problems and where they actually want to go. Is there a place where people can contact you, or do you have events, or how does it work? Like, how do people kind of socially stalk you, but also reach out if they need at least that conversation and maybe some help in pinpointing those problems? Yeah,
I'd say socially stalking, Twitter is where I'm most active. So at Jared Tendler. They can go to my website, JayWongTV.com. That's kind of where I have, like, a lot of information on my coaching for traders, for poker players, for golfers. But, you know, like you mentioned, I'm working with entrepreneurs now too. I'm also working in eSports with professional video gamers. So, you know, it just sort of the model is growing and expanding. But I actually have a lot more articles and podcasts listed on JaredTendlerPoker.com. And as you found, like, it's not all poker there. There are more kind of generalizable topics, so you don't have to be an expert in either of those in poker to be able to kind of get something from it. These are the 2 places to get in touch. At the moment, I have a little bit of a delay in terms of how long it takes for new clients to come on board. So if somebody wants to work with me, just a function of time. But they certainly can reach out through either of those websites or through Twitter if they're interested in coaching. Yeah, well, I was going to say, I mean, we'll obviously link to everything below the video and for the podcast, but your podcast is awesome.
You know, getting a chance to interview, other. You're right. There's more than just poker players there, and even financial interviews. But the fact that I wanted to bring you on because I think for creators, entrepreneurs, people that are they're going against the grain a little bit, and they have to get clear on not just who they are, but their gifts and ultimately their performance in terms of being a leader for people in their lives, whether it's their team or their family. I think it's massively important. And so I know we went through a lot, and I'd love to wrap up in this way, but the name of the show is called the Inner Changemaker. So what comes to mind for you? What words or images comes to mind for you when you hear the word changemaker?
System. When you have a good system or a good framework for understanding how you operate, just not necessarily you per se, like as Jay and Jared, but like as in like us, like we are not that different at our core, right? DNA wise, that's obvious, but for the most part, like from a systems and a foundational framework perspective, we are very, very similar. If you understand those rules of the game, it is so much easier, because a lot of people are fighting themselves because they don't know what game they're actually playing.
Right.
And so, the poker books, right, they are definitely written for poker players. But I have had traders and golfers, and like people have picked it up. I mean, yes, you kind of have to wade through some of the language, but again, if you focus on, the books were written to provide people with the structure and the foundation to understand how to solve their own problems. They're not just like a collection of advice. Like the thing that I hear the most often, and the thing that I advocated the most, is like, treat the book like a resource. Treat the book like something that you're going to have to read again and again, because you have to learn the framework. If you learn the framework, it really is like teaching yourself how to fish. At that point, you don't have to rely on a fish market, right? You don't have to rely on somebody giving it to you. You can become the person who can be that inner change maker. That is, to me, like the power in the system, right? And so, you're not always going to have the answers, but like how I would ideally like to be positioned in the long term is everybody knows the system. They just come to me to help them diagnose things and help them maybe to strategize around how to train it, right? But so often I have to train the system on top of doing the analysis, the diagnosis, the training. It's complex. That's where we need a lot of sessions. But if you know the system, you can make progress yourself, right? Maybe it's not perfect, but it certainly is going to be progress. I mean, I don't offer guarantees, because the guarantees have to come from the person actually putting in good work and good effort. But there is so much predictability when you have a good system, and that's what I feel like I have. And it's not perfect, but again, at a core level, that inner changemaker is not something esoteric. It's not something random. It's something that can be very sort of foundational and systematic.
Yeah, and actually, I'm so glad that you said that word, systems, because that was a system, right? That there is a systematic approach to being in peak state or high performance, or making it, as you say, the only choice. And so I thought you've been a perfect example of a change maker, but also you exemplified having your own system, relying on that to be able to step into that, and helping your clients and the people you get a chance to work with. So I must commend you, Jared. I mean, it's been awesome to have you on, and for people that are watching and listening, please go pick up one copy of his book and listen to the podcast. Try to get and like he says, choose progress, over all of this. And I think it's such an important message. So, Jared, thank you again so much for coming on and having this conversation with me. And I really invite our listeners and watchers to give you a follow and to be, socially stalking you, as we say. And for everyone that's watching this, thank you again for tuning in. Can't wait to see you guys in the next episode. And remember, it's not about changing the world, but it's about making yourself the best version of yourself so you can impact those closest to you. This is Jay, this is Jared, and we'll see you guys next time.